affected. Okay, so a quick recap on what is ransomware. So it's ransom software, and essentially the way that it works is that it encrypts all of the files on your computer, and if your computer is part of a network, it will also infect the files that are on the file server as well. And when they're encrypted, when the files are encrypted, they essentially become unusable. So what the cyber criminals do is essentially demand a ransom to then decrypt the files so that you can use them again. So there's been some very popular ones in the news, CryptoLocker, Tesla Crypt, Crypto Wall. I'm sure that everyone's heard of these in the news at some point. So as I mentioned on the last webinar, we really focused on phishing attacks. So essentially what that is, it's a form of social engineering. So users will typically receive an electronic communication, a spam email, but it looks very legitimate but has malicious intent. So there's some examples there currently from Telstra and the Australian Federal Police and many others. Phishing emails, they used to be quite easy to identify, but now the cyber criminals are creating these emails and they look very authentic, and it's one of the reasons why it's been so successful. So if you haven't seen our previous webinar, I'd really encourage you to log on to YouTube and just search for the Diamond Technology Group channel and check it out. Today what we're really going to focus more on is just overall IT hygiene. And I suppose the first point I want to make here is that it is everyone's responsibility inside your organisation. So everyone contributes to the overall hygiene of your IT systems. Anyone that interacts with your systems at all is ultimately responsible for the hygiene or potentially lack thereof in that environment. So I suppose the key point that I want to make here is that humans or your staff are as big a part of your overall security strategy as any of the technical solutions that you might put in place. So, you know, by way of a simple example, you might spend a lot of money on a lot of different security measures, but you know, what if a staff member puts an important password down on a sticky note and attaches it to their monitor, for example? So it's really important that there's, I suppose, a culture inside the organisation of good security practices. So what does a healthy network look like? And I think for most small to medium-sized organisations, if you asked them 5 to 10 years ago what were the key points, I think what most of them would say was, well, you know, as long as my Windows security patches are installed and as long as I've got antivirus on my desktop, I feel like I'm pretty covered. And that probably was accurate back then. But fast forward to today and the threat of ransomware, and certainly that's really not the case these days. You need to have a more holistic security strategy than just ensuring that your patches are up to date and that you've got antivirus. So a really simple example of that is perimeter security. So does your organization have a cheap consumer router that connects you to the internet, or do you have an advanced firewall or a unified threat management device that's actually not only connecting you to the internet, but providing security around what users can and can't do? So in fact, I would argue that these days probably perimeter security and having a UTM device is as important, or maybe even more important, than having antivirus on your desktop. But it's surprising how often that's overlooked. Another example is password policies. So what a lot of people probably don't realize is that in a Microsoft Windows environment, password policies aren't actually enabled by default. So what do I mean by password policies? Well, things like having a minimum length of password, having complexity, enforcing users to change their password on a regular basis. So these are all policies that are part of your Windows operating system that, again, are not on by default and really need to be enabled by your IT provider. So within Diamond, we actually have a dedicated team of specialists that look at these issues. So we call it the technology optimization team. So they don't do any projects, they don't do any support. Their entire role is to evaluate best practices in the industry and ensure that our customers' environments are configured correctly and that they have the right devices that they need. So what are some of the vulnerable entry points? And there's no question that probably the key one right now is if your organization has a remote desktop server, or it used to be called a terminal server, that is publicly available. In other words, are you able to connect to your remote desktop server no matter where you are in the world? Now, if that's the case, that's actually quite a vulnerable entry point. And what's happening these days is that cyber criminals are creating swarms of infected computers. They call them a botnet. And what they're doing is that they're targeting these remote desktop servers via something called a brute force attack. And in really simple terms, what they're really just attempting to do is using a whole range or combination of username and passwords. They're making many attempts at trying to log in. So it's not unusual for a system to have thousands, maybe tens of thousands of login attempts every 24 hours if your system is open to the world. So it is a very there's a high potential risk if your remote desktop server is publicly available. I suppose what goes hand in hand with that is having weak passwords. These do certainly make you more vulnerable. And it's important to keep in mind too that it's not only your staff accounts that you need to think of. We've seen plenty of examples where third-party vendor accounts are actually the ones that get compromised. So what I mean by that is, for example, you might have a multifunction printer in your environment, and to be able to do scan to emails and certain functions, the print provider will actually set up a username and password within your environment. Now the problem is if they create a weak username password combination, then they can create a point of vulnerability in your network. Another really good example of poor IT hygiene is inactive accounts. So what I mean by this is I've seen plenty of examples again where organizations have users from 5 or more years ago still active, or I should say still enabled on their system. So they're not being used, but they're actually still enabled. So this is a really good example of the kind of things that we do as part of our proactive technology optimization, is to make sure that those types of accounts are cleaned up and are actually properly disabled. And I suppose another point to mention here is just around more targeted attacks. So an example of this I heard recently was a university lecturer had published a paper. And unfortunately, when you publish a paper, your details go out into the public domain. And she was then contacted by an organisation purporting to be one of the universities in the UK and wanting her to do a talk on her paper. So she was flattered and accepted and paid some money to basically reserve a spot at this talk. And she flew all the way to the UK only to discover that the whole thing had actually been a hoax. So I suppose this is an example of how sophisticated cyber criminals are becoming, that they're targeting down to that level. So what we're seeing is perhaps your individual organisation might not be targeted, but certainly your industry might be targeted in some way. So it's just really important to be aware of these issues. So again, just to quickly touch on what we call our proactive technology optimization. I think, again, if we look back to the past, often what happened is a server, once it was installed, it was pretty much left as it was. It was maintained and there were patches installed, but beyond that, the configuration of the system really wasn't changed, it wasn't touched. But technology and threats are changing so rapidly that it's actually imperative to continually evaluate the configuration and design of your network. and if necessary, make changes in line with the changing industry best practices. So some of the reports that you see here are examples of areas that our technology optimization team are continuously evaluating and improving, regardless of how the system was initially set up. So even with the best planning, you still need to have contingency, and certainly in the case of ransomware, the single most important thing is to have a working backup solution. So I think a lot of people take this a little bit for granted, and I'll give some examples. So monitoring your backups is really important, and although it sounds really obvious, it's really important to make sure that your IT provider is actively demonstrating that they're monitoring for successful backups. I heard of an incident recently where an organisation was hit with ransomware, and they had to recover from a backup that was actually 2 weeks old because they were unaware, and their IT provider was unaware, that backups had stopped working. So it sounds very obvious, but it's just so critical that you speak to your IT provider and have them demonstrate to you that the backups are working. Capacity planning is very important as well. So obviously you need to be speaking to them about your service capacity and then what that means for your backups as well. So if you're, for example, swapping external hard drives, you need to know when they're likely to become full and plan well in advance to get larger hard drives if that's what's required. So content validation is also really important. And again, just to give an example here, I recently performed an audit for an organisation, and they had 2 servers, and I asked the owner of this business what he thought was being backed up, and of course he said, well, I think the whole system's being backed up, and he was shocked to learn that in fact only part of one of the systems, one of the servers was being backed up, and the other server was actually not being backed up at all. And it actually had his line of business application and his financial systems as well. So you can just imagine what might have happened had there been a ransomware attack or even just a hardware failure. It could have been devastating or catastrophic for that person's business. So again, it's really important that you speak to your IT provider about, well, you know, what exactly are you backing up? Please provide evidence of that. And just a last point there, on encryption, just make sure your IT provider is encrypting your backup. And again, this is something that's not a default, so you actually need to enable this feature. And what it ensures is that if, for example, your backups are on a rotating hard drives and they become stolen, it makes sure that whoever has it actually doesn't have access to it if it's encrypted. So again, this is just a great example of best practices that often aren't implemented. So I think one of the key things for small to medium-sized businesses is to consider cloud backup. With internet and storage costs continually decreasing, it is becoming a more realistic and affordable option. So what I like about it is that it takes away the human elements, and what I mean by that is typically for most small to medium organisations, there's somebody internally who's designated with a job of either switching tapes and taking them off site, or maybe their hard drives. But few organisations have contingencies around when that person's on leave, or if they're unexpectedly sick. Typically, the backups just simply aren't rotated. So again, that's just something that's really important, and a reason why I like cloud backup. Essentially, it's also more secure. Because it's actually completely separated from your network. So if your network's not configured very well, it's actually possible when you have a ransomware attack that the ransomware can actually encrypt the backups as well as the files on your file server. So again, that's why I like cloud backup, because it essentially separates those 2 environments. And a final point here that I want to make is that there's a really big difference between a backup and disaster recovery. And a lot of people I speak to mistakenly think that these are kind of one in the same. So if you're confused about that point, make sure you have the conversation with your IT provider and make sure that they explain to you the differences and what you do and don't have in that respect. So One of the key ways really of avoiding ransomware is just having strong policies and procedures inside your organization. So I've listed there the first point there of warmware, and what that is essentially is just your people. So as I mentioned before, your people are just as important as any technical solution that you invest in. So, a great example here is, do you allow your staff to look at their personal emails on a work computer? So again, you might have sophisticated anti-spam solutions in place, but of course that doesn't cover your staff members' private email accounts. So again, it's just important that you have a procedure or a policy around whether they can or can't access personal emails. Having just a general security culture is just so important. I mean, it needs to be discussed in staff meetings. You want to have your staff be really security conscious. A great example, one that I heard about a year ago now, was a staff member in an organisation that later on a Friday afternoon he clicked on an email and he suspected that that this was potentially a bogus email, but he just didn't worry about it. He basically left his system on, went home, and of course when everyone arrived in the office Monday morning, the whole system, the entire network was essentially down because he'd left ransomware running for an entire weekend. So I suppose I use that to illustrate that it's just critical that your staff are security conscious, not just the HR department or not just the CEO. Everyone from top to bottom is taking a mindset of being conscious of security issues. So obviously you need to make sure that there's training, and again we have some online material around how to identify phishing attacks, and I'd encourage people to have a look at that. And I think it's also really important that security and IT security is actually part of your induction process, because of course new staff coming into the organisation need to be aware from day one that they have a responsibility around the security of your systems. So again, just to touch on what to do if you think you've been infected, the key here is to immediately disconnect your system from the network. So take out the blue cable or turn off your wireless if you're on a laptop, or just shut your system down. That's the main thing there. Call your IT provider, and as I mentioned before, really your only option is to recover from backup. So just to finish off today, just to let you know that we actually have an online security assessment, and I'd really encourage people to do that assessment. Really what it focuses on is going beyond just having antivirus on your desktop. What other security mechanisms and features do you have in your system? And if when you go through that assessment that your score is quite low, please do contact us, and we'd be more than happy to help. The other thing to mention too is that we do have our webinar series up on YouTube, so if you just search for Diamond Technology Group on YouTube, you'll find us there. So thanks for joining us today.